Hello and welcome to this tutorial on utilizing Labelbox's Python SDK to create and work through a video data export. I've gone ahead here and installed the necessary dependencies and packages, and I've also input a project ID of a video project with completed labels. I've also input my API key here, established my client, and I've called the getProject method on the client class to set my project object in this project variable. Now, to actually create a video data export, I'm going to call the export labels method on my project object, and I'm going to restore the results of this in my export URL variable because I'm going to be generating a URL from this. And also keep in mind that I can run export labels with start and end parameters, and this will export only the labels created between these two dates I input inclusively. So if I run this cell to generate this export, it'll take a few seconds to complete, and it's completed. And I can print out this export URL here. And now I'm going to use the requests class here to get the contents stored in this URL in a JSON format. And I'm going to store this in my exports variable. So I'm just completing the setup of my export here. And if we want to see more information on what fields are contained in a label payload, we can just follow this link to our documentation right here. When working with a video export, it's essential to remember a few differences between this type of export and an image or text export. The main one being that for a video export, a list of exports is created rather than one single export with one export per data row. So if I ask for the type of this exports variable here, we see that it's a list. If I want to check out the export for the first data row, I can ask for the first indice here, the 0th indice, and I can see the information stored for this first export on the first data row for which a label was completed. And we can see all the various keys and values here in this JSON. To access keys and values of this JSON, to access these values, I can call upon the key within the first index of my exports list. So if I want to see my data row ID created by or created at values or my reviews, I can ask for the key here and I'll receive the value in return so I can get my label ID, who created this label, when it was created at, and any reviews if any exist. And if I wish to view the video in my browser, I can ask to see the video URL of the data that was labeled. I'm not going to follow this right now, but this would just be a link to the video that comprises the data row. Now, if I wish to view the individual annotations on the frames in this first export here, I need to access the URL that's stored right here under frames. So I'm going to do that by asking, just as I called upon these keys here, but for one level deeper, for my label and then my frames. And I'm going to print out that annotations URL. And then to authorize viewing of this URL here, I need to pass in my API key, and then I'll call upon my request class again to get the annotation URL with my headers set using my authorization. So if I run this cell right here, we've grabbed our annotations. And the next thing we're going to do is just a neat little trick here to make the annotations easier to read. We're going to sort them by frame number and add a key for the frame number for each annotation in our list of annotations so that we know which individual frame that annotation was made on. Additionally, in this cell, we're going to grab the first frame by asking for annotations 1 here, keeping in mind that when we set this list here, 1 will be the first index, not 0. And if I run this cell right here, we can see on frame number 1 all of the objects or annotations that comprise the label on this first frame, or the first frame of this label, I should say. So we have a few jellyfish objects here in our JSON. And then, similarly to above, I can use keys to access values of this JSON. So I'm going to dig into this objects list here. If we noted that this was a list of objects in our JSON for this first frame. And if we want to look at this first object, I can grab the schema ID, the title of the object that was used, which will be jellyfish, whether or not it's a keyframe, which means that an annotation was created or adjusted rather than it being interpolated on that frame. And then we can ask for the dimensions of the bounding box on that frame. So we see here I have my schema ID for the jellyfish object, the title of that object. It is a keyframe, so we have the Boolean true, and then the coordinates for our bounding box that we created. So using these keys, we can grab pretty much all of the essential information for any individual frame or object that was annotated on that frame of a video. So this is a really powerful way to read and work with your data. And you can apply these to different keys that you can view in the label payload, which we have plenty of documentation that's linked for you to read over if you want to learn more. Lastly, we'll just go over this quickly. It's a neat little snippet of code here to be able to view the video as individual frames and visualize our annotations. So I'll run these cells without too much detail here, but we're setting up a system where we write to a file and then we capture the video contents in this cell here, and then we create a function to visualize our bounding boxes using the coordinates. So we see here we're working through each frame of this video. Once this cell is completed, we'll move on to the next. I'll start running this function here as well. So we've worked through 19 frames. I've set my visualize bounding box function, and then now we'll overlay the annotations onto these frames that we just saw visualized above. And we can see here our bounding boxes right here in our Colab environment. Just a neat little trick to visualize the work we've done, all utilizing Python code and our built-in SDK functions. So that's all for this tutorial. Thanks for watching.